Firstly, thank you for coming, and I'm getting a little bit of feedback there, just turn that around. I'm pretty sure that many of you have seen Bob Segrave at U3A events and at around town, but he's a rather quiet man, like so many people with a fascinating story to tell. And I'm delighted, firstly, that I get the opportunity to go through this with Bob, but secondly, that he will share his story with you, because it is a fascinating tale over his, next month, 83 years. 86. Mm-hmm. There you go. I discounted for you. Thank you. Okay, first thing I guess I want to ask Bob is, where was Bob Segrave, say, 80 odd years ago or 75 years ago?
Yeah, is it okay without the microphone? Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yeah, I prefer not to use it. I think the mic reverberates a bit. No, I was born in the suburb of Elstonwick in Melbourne, and I was an only child. And it seems that there were quite a few people like my mother in those days who were sort of socially motivated, and to further her aim, she sent me to a very good public school in Melbourne. Actually, I was there at the same time as Barry Humphries. He was a year ahead of me, which makes him 87, so I think he's doing pretty well.
I turn that off.
Yes, I will.
Yeah, it's probably more feedback than
Yes.
yeah, that wasn't the happiest time of my life. I found there was a fair amount of snobbery at the school, and it was not a very pleasant place to go if you were in any way sort of shy. I think I was probably a fairly shy child. I undoubtedly did learn some things there. One beauty I did have, I did have one good teacher. And I think during our lives, if we come across one good teacher, we're doing well. I think his motivation was not that of so many teachers, of trying to fill you up with as much information as possible and to groom you to pass examinations, but he felt his job was to impart a love of his subject. And I think that's the definition of a good teacher. He was a teacher of English. He was a little Welshman. And when we were having our English classes, Welsh have a love of the stage and beautiful diction, lovely voices, and he would stand in front of us all, and when we were doing, say, Shakespeare, he would act out the characters. So suddenly Shakespeare came to life for all of us. Possibly as a result of his influence, I went on ultimately to become a journalist, so I'd be involved with words and expression and whatnot, because he imparted a love of the English language and a fascination with language in general that fortunately I still have with me these days. I did, on leaving school, I did my national service in the Air Force, and one of the influences I had there was a Church of England padre, who was quite a remarkable chap. And somehow I ascribed his remarkability to the fact that he was a Church of England padre, but in fact that was just the sort of chap he was. But because of his influence, I decided that I too would like to become a Church of England minister, so I put my name down and embarked on study, but not long after I started, I met up with a stepfather of a good friend of mine, and that stepfather was a leading light in the News and Information Bureau in Canberra, which was the government's sort of PR body. We were chatting one night, and he said, "Now Bob, what are you going to do when you leave with the rest of your life?" I said, "I'm going to become a chaplain." He said, "No, you're not." He knew me better than I did. And within about 3 weeks he started me off as a cadet with Australian United Press. And in those days we had a cadetship, which meant that you had to work your way through the full gamut of journalistic coverage, which involved courts, police rounds, politics, education, the lot. You had to do the lot. I think in these days, do they still have cadetships?
Yes, they do.
They do. Well, not much based on university education, I think.
That's right. Usually now they start at 4 years after university education.
Yeah. Whereas in those days, your training was strictly on the job with seasoned journalists, and it was a very good start. I then went on to work in a number of newspapers, the Geelong Advertiser, the Cairns Post. I worked with the ABC, and so I was with sort of rural and regional media, and also I was with the Age for quite a while. One thing I did learn was the advantage of having worked on regional and rural newspapers. When you're a journalist, you report the news, and you can either just report it straight or put a bit of background to it. You're a member of the community, and you become part of that community, and you realise that there are different ways of presenting the news, some to the benefit of the community and others to the detriment of the community. And I found that, say on the Bendigo Advertiser, I'd go along to a council meeting and I'd report what the mayor said. Then the next morning I'd have to go along and buy my meat from him because he was the local butcher. That gives you a sense of, I think, responsibility to the community's needs, which you don't really get on a major daily like the Age, where you sort of breeze in, report everything without knowing any of the background, and then breeze out again. So I found that regional journalism really set up some standards for me as to how to deal properly with the news within the community.
Did you come across any occasions where there was a conflict between yourself and the mayor in the butcher shop, or others?
Yes, there were quite a number. It's a matter of how you read things within the community. There were times when I felt that what the council was doing was wrong, what the police were doing was wrong, and I felt this had to be noted. But first of all, I referred it to the editor, because he was the one who carried the ultimate responsibility, and if it was okay with him, well then it sort of went ahead. If it didn't, well, it had failed the sort of test. And I must say my best experience of that editorial responsibility was when I was working on the Age under a man called Panton, who some of you may know. I think, well, he was the greatest editor that I've ever known, and the advantage of working with the Age then was it was owned by the Syme family, and there was an agreement between the owners and the journalists that all editorial decisions would be made by the journalists, so the family sort of stayed out. When you compare that with what happened in the Murdoch Empire, you can sort of see quite a big difference, and a difference which can be to the detriment of the community's interests, I think.
If I may, Graham Perkins was very much a publish and be damned kind of editor, wasn't he?
He took on a lot of risk, but he was prepared to wear them, and he would back you to the hilt too. He wouldn't sort of drop you if you had made an error of judgment. He was a very honest, straight-dealing person. He was a lovely person himself. He was just so honest. You knew where you were all the time with Graham. And it's people like that, working with people like that, I think, that help to mould you as you progress in your career. And it was certainly his example that set me on a pretty good course, I think, right from the start.
Did you find that a career in journalism brought anything to you personally, as a human being?
Well, as I think that feeling of responsibility. It was almost like becoming involved in a football team or any activity where, as opposed within the family, when you're growing up, the things you do for the family you do automatically, but when you get out into life, there's not that same feeling you have about the community, you think about yourself, but when you're involved in a football team, or as I found as a journalist, you have to think beyond yourself, and you have to think not only what's good for you, but what is good for everybody else. And that sort of empathy, I think, is something that can carry a community. If there's a lot of empathy within the community, that community can forward, but if it's not there, it's a very hard slog. And that was something I think I learned through journalism, is what I was writing wasn't for myself. I didn't have to gratify myself, but I had to make sure that the interests of the community were well served, so that, as far as I was concerned, the media was a servant of the people, but a guiding light, and you had to be pretty sure within yourself that what you were writing was to the benefit of everyone else.
Very much so. After newspapers, where to?
I then went into public relations. I worked for Volkswagen Australasia and Mount Isa Mines. Mount Isa Mines was quite interesting. It was a very interesting job. I went up there as public relations officer up to Mount Isa, and I had a very big budget. And one of the jobs I had was producing a prestige magazine outlining all the benefits of living and working in Mount Isa.
A thick magazine then. A thick magazine then.
Yeah, well I had to try and make it thick. But I had the advantage of, as I say, an enormous budget, which meant I could charter planes from Mount Isa and fly over to the Northern Territory, up to North Queensland, looking for stories which showed the region up in a good light. And that brought with it many quite exciting experiences of I went to cover the annual bush race meeting at U3AW, which is a place on the Northern Territory border, and chartered a light plane. We landed in the main street, taxied down the street and pulled into the parking lot behind the hotel. I had the advantage of getting out into a lot of communities like the missions, and I remember particularly calling into the Mitchell River Mission up in Cape York, and it was quite a religious mission, of course, and the pilot landed, Julie taxied, and then I saw him take a small cart on with him and walk back along the airfield until he came to a particular post, and he had a little shovel with him. He dug a big hole and placed his cart on and then covered it over again. I thought this behaviour rather peculiar. But I checked with him later, and of course liquor was not allowed on the mission, but there were a few drinkers there, so they had this arrangement of smuggling supplies in, burying them there, and then they'd go out at an appropriate time and retrieve the spoils. There were loads of beautiful things that happened while I was up in Cape York. I think a lot of those things would echo with Cole, who's also had a lot of experience of North Queenslanders and how different they can be and what a lovely people they are.
Bob, it's kind of a paradox that you've got to produce a slick sales publication for an area and you're mixing with the salt of the earth kind of people, isn't it?
Kept my feet on the ground.
Yes.
Yeah. But the other nice thing that happened there, being public relations officer, of course, I put out press releases, and while I was there, the ABC contacted me and asked me if I would be their stringer or their local correspondent for North West Queensland. So I approached the Mount Isa management and they said, yes, that's fine. So I gave one copy of the press release myself and sent that off to the ABC and used the other one in my own internal publications. And then the manager of the local commercial radio station realised that the ABC was running quite a lot of news that he didn't have access to. So he approached me and asked me if I'd set up my own radio news on his commercial station. So then I ended up giving one copy to the ABC, 2 copies to myself, one to the company, one to read over my morning news service. there was possibly a conflict of interest there, but
It does explain your schizophrenia, doesn't it?
Three salaries, I hope.
Yes.
Three salaries, I hope.
Well, true. I milked the written word for everything I could get out of it.
Did you like radio as a medium?
So much depends in radio, I think, on who's controlling it. I think if I enjoyed it when I was able to express my own opinions, but I think my experience at the age with Graham Perkins helped further that. But I found that there were, when a commercial station is owned commercially, then the dollar becomes paramount. And I found that there was what I didn't like was the interference I got from management about certain lines to take and what lines I wasn't to cross and who were to be reported favourably and who weren't. That I found quite unpleasant. But generally I found in my public relations work that I was always representing obviously someone else, and in the case of say Volkswagen, success was measured in how many vehicles were sold, and it wasn't until I ended up at Trobe University as doing their public relations that it was almost a great weight had been lifted from my shoulders, because I realised that I personally believed in the advantages of education, and I got a lot of satisfaction, rather than getting satisfaction out of another Volkswagen being sold. I got satisfaction out of the whole concept of education being sold, being explained properly to the public. And for once I could actually believe in what I was doing in public relations, which was nice. When I started it, I had a few jobs in between Mount Isa
And the Trobe. But you finished up growing quite an empire there, didn't you?
Well, yeah, that really taught me something too, that the administrative structure often goes against personal fulfilment, because I had interests in journalism and photography and artwork and publications, and I was taken on to Trobe University in 1966, that's one date I can remember, which was a year before the university actually opened. So we moved out onto site in '66, and we occupied part of the library and college, which were the first buildings built on the campus. And I was in charge of all those areas, a one-man band, myself, my secretary and an administrative assistant. I was there for 10 years. Initially I enjoyed myself thoroughly because I had all these creative areas that I was personally involved in. At the end of 10 years I had quite a large department consisting of an art studio and a printery and a publishing arm and a public relations section. And there was I sitting at the top of all this signing other people's memoranda, which was a far cry from the intellectual and creative challenge that I had when I first started there. But my one salvation, I think, was having started that early and being involved in the formation of various clubs. The university decided that an Australian Mills Football Club should be established. And because I had actually played, administration asked me if I'd help form the club. So I did, and we duly in 1967 fielded our first team. That club is still going strong, and it's nice to say they still have the best and fairest trophy as the Bob Segrave trophy after some 50 years. It was quite a shock to some of the members when I actually turned up one night recently to present the trophy, because I discovered then that it had been known as the Bob Segrave Memorial Trophy. So quite a few members were pleasantly surprised. But that was quite a lovely experience being involved with a lot of young blokes. The university administration and academics, many of them had the point of view that if it wasn't for the students, the university would be quite a nice place. And administration felt if it wasn't for the academics, the university could be a nice place. And when I started to become involved with the students, a lot of people sort of turned down their noses, oh, you don't want to associate with them. But I found enormous pleasure. We went through, some of you may remember, we went through the Vietnam War and a lot of protests, student protests, run-ins with the police and whatnot, and I found that my knowledge of the students stood in good stead. I was able to stand up in court and testify, and many of them I'm still quite friends with. Now, after some 50 years, we're still good friends and keep in touch. So as with a lot of things, sport itself has a lot of disadvantages, but it does have that, as I said, I think some time ago, that it's a matter of giving. In sport, you learn that you often sacrifice yourself for the sake of the team, and that can be quite a good learning experience too, to overcome your own barriers and learn to give, learn how important giving is.
Universities can be seen as somewhat remote institutions from real life. How did you go projecting an image from a Trobe University to the wider community?
Yeah, well, that was an important part of the job, and it was done through keeping awake to what was happening in the community and seeing where community trends went and how community sentiment was going. And a lot of it was done through press releases, finding the right person, finding the right academic to explain what was actually behind a lot of the work coming out of the university on an academic level, and also bringing to the attention of the public the work that the university was doing on a community level, the organisations we were joining in with, and arranging open days where members of the public were invited to come along to the university and meet the staff and meet representatives of the students and try and get a better idea of how universities worked and interacted with the community, which after all, of course, was supporting them. And generally I found a good response from academics. Most of them were aware of the need to explain what they were doing, and I think generally we had quite a favourable reaction from the public when it came to things like student protests and whatnot. It was pretty important, I felt, to explain, or help to explain and get the students themselves to explain what they were actually on about. The idealism, often no practicality attached to the idealism of kids who just left home and out in the world for the first place and seen all the wrongs and taken on themselves the job of fixing them regardless of consequences in many cases. But helping to explain what it was on about and getting public support for what the students were trying to do.
Well, Mary has a question.
Yes, Bob, I'm completely ignorant about the Vietnam protests because I was still in the UK at that point, and I'd like to know what actually happened. Were the students penalised in any way for taking part in demonstrations?
Well, many of them were. Many of them ended up in jail.
Did the university support them?
There was an ambivalent view, I think. There were those who did support them and those who didn't, but the universities themselves maintained a fairly neutral viewpoint. They didn't sort of commit themselves either way. But I found myself that I was able to not so much intervene, but liaise between the police and the students and the legal profession. The university itself did take action, the Trobe University did take action against some of its students because, unfortunately, as with many of these demonstrations, as we've seen, they start off with the best of intentions, and there are a group of idealistic groups who start them, but often there are more militaristic groups within the community who are just very anxious to provoke authorities, and they sometimes can take over these movements, and they're the ones who tend towards the violence. They get their jollies, as a friend of mine says, they get their jollies out of the provocation of authority. They're the ones that do all the damage.
So were there any careers wrecked at that point?
I don't know of any. There were some academics, I think, who were jailed, but because it was such an emotive issue, it wasn't as though it was a sort of a criminal misdemeanour. It was more an idealistic misdemeanour. I think that at an academic level, it was regarded as not as serious as it could otherwise. A jail term was not regarded as serious as it could have been in other circumstances.
A badge of honour in some cases.
Sorry?
A badge of honour in
Yeah,
some
that's
cases.
right. Yeah.
But what state were you in?
This was Victoria.
So you weren't in Queensland. It was quite, as one who went to jail several times, as a big
Right.
okay. They were pretty tough.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I think, I don't know, I think the police in Queensland, I know, well, from my experience when I was working up there at Mount Isa and in Kees, the police force went through various stages, sometimes
Yeah, the
sort
Lewis
of violence,
stage,
and other
yes.
times not.
Yeah.
If the violent stage coincided with something
So,
that...
can I ask you, when were you in Mount Isa? Was that, so that would have been sometime, would it have been in the, I don't want to, would it have been in the 50s or?
I think it was the late 50s. I'm very vague as far as dates, I'm afraid, but I think it was the late 50s.
Yes.
It was just before the big strike, the Pat Mackey strike at Mount Isa. I was lucky enough, I had a house there, and luckily I was just able to move out before the strike, because once the strike happened, the whole place shut down and no one was selling anything.
Thank you.
Well, a view from the other side of the fence. When Newcastle University first started to get proactive with its public relations department, working journalists saw it rather cynically until they started to produce expert lists. This was a list of the academics that you could call, who would explain in detail various aspects of specialities in economics, science, etc. And it became an extremely useful resource for journalists.
Yeah. Yes, I think, I remember when I was a journalist, I tended to look down on PR people, thinking they were trying to sell me something all the time.
Yeah.
But when you're trying to sell education, that's an okay thing.
Yes.
It's different if you're trying to sell Volkswagen cars, but
Yes.
selling education is an okay thing. I think.
Yes. Yes. What was your family at this stage? You were married? You had children?
Married. When we were in Mount Isa, we had one child. We subsequently had two more. Unfortunately, two of those subsequently died in separate accidents, 2 years apart, when they were both 28. And so we were quite thankful when our third child, Robin, survived to the age of 29. We also lost a grandson too. And we've had a fair history of tragedy in the family. Which actually,
Okay.
many things in your life, you can look at them in various ways, but I think that the tragedies that we had, when I looked at it and my response to it, it made me realise that in my response there was a great deal of egotism and making my own arrangements with my daughter after my wife died. And she said, "Well, what shall I do for your funeral? What do you want?" I said, "No, it's up to you, surprise me." Subsequently, I bought myself a cardboard coffin, and Robin has marked out a nice spot in the bush for the coffin to be laid. But so many of the sort of the funeral arrangements are made almost as though the person being buried is going to be there, so you've somehow got to sort of please them. I know there are a lot of other things involved too, but when I looked at my own reaction to their children's deaths, I realised that people said, "Oh, there's a life cut short." what was important to me was enjoying the rest of that life. So I was mourning my loss, which is fair enough, I suppose, if you realise it, but I think we often somehow have the idea that the person who is suffering is the person who has died. Anyway, that's just an aside.
No, it's a very good aside. Was it from the Trobe that you became a restaurateur?
Yes. After 10 lovely years at the Trobe, I've often thought that the ideal job is one that you would do if you weren't getting paid. And that was how I felt about the Trobe University. I found it so fulfilling that I would have quite happily worked there for no pay. Well, had I not had to provide for the family, of course. Just before my 10th year, my wife's mother and stepfather both died within a short period of each other. Now, I should probably fill you in with a bit of background on my wife's family. Her mother was an aristocratic German lady, came from a very good family, who'd been sent off to finishing school, where she learnt all the duties of running a household and cooking and whatnot, whereas she herself wanted to actually be trained as an architect, but that was not on the agenda. She married a senior executive with the Bayer Leverkusen pharmaceutical company, and he was sent out to Australia to take over Bayer's operations here, but just as the ship arrived in Sydney, war was declared, and he was welcomed to Australia by being interned at a camp in Tatura in Victoria, which was for so-called aliens, and he spent the duration of the war there. And my mother-in-law had 2 children, my daughter and my wife and her brother, and she got involved with the art world. She knew people like the Boyds and John Percival quite well, and she ended up actually living. She was quite a character, my mother-in-law. She ended up living with an artist called Daniel Vasiliev up in one of the many art colonies along the Yarra. And he was building a stone house out of local rock, which she helped him with. As the war progressed, well, in fact, when the war, just as the war finished, my father-in-law and mother-in-law were divorced, and my mother-in-law married a chap called John Royal, who was with the ABC for many years as an announcer. And I think he was one of the first announcers with the Radio Australia, I think, but then he ended up on the ABC in Victoria for many years. And they bought a block of land at Narrewarren East in Victoria, out past Berwick. And they didn't have very much money, so they started building their own house out of local rock, which they did. And then when they finished that after about 20 years, my mother-in-law realised that they needed some more money to help to keep the place solvent, because they built on the outskirts of Melbourne early in the piece, and then of course the suburbs caught up with them. They had 20 acres and the rates became quite enormous. So she started building a restaurant out of local rock, pretty well on her own, without council permission. And
some people call that entrepreneurship.
Indeed, yeah, well, she was an entrepreneur, if nothing else, quite a character. And eventually she built this edifice that seats 100 people, and used all local produce, local staff, and council realised that the place had gone up without their permission, so they sent an inspector out. He had to look over the place, and eventually he went along to us and he said, "You need an extra bolt in that beam." He had to find some fault with the place. Fortunately, amongst our customers, we had a civil engineer who came out and he said, "I will fix that." Which he did, and then the restaurant was ready to up and go. And because of John Roy's status in the media, was quite attended by all the best people. There was one particular chap I should always remember, Robin Krabbe, who was a leading figure in the Melbourne media and a sportsman. And he had the temerity to ask my mother-in-law for ice cream with his cheesecake. And Lottie glared at him and she said, "In this restaurant, you do not have ice cream with cheesecake." Despite the fact that it was Ron Brassie. Anyway, that's the background to the place. We ran it for, I think it was 4 or 5 years. I left the Trobe University just before my 10th year finished, and we took up the business of restaurateurs, which neither of us had any experience with or inkling of what was on the horizon. Fortunately, somehow the idea came to us that the only type of restaurant we could run properly and genuinely was the sort of restaurant we'd like to go to ourselves. So we set it up on that basis, and it was definitely a family restaurant. The staff knew the customers, and I kept a big book of all the customers' names and how each customer knew each other customer, and had a very nice jazz trio playing on Saturday night and folk music on Friday night. And we settled into a life. I quite enjoyed it because I was front of house and looking after all the customers who were all out to have a good time. My wife, I feel sorry for her, she copped the business side of it. all the kitchen work and the ordering of suppliers and maintenance of staff and whatnot. The big thing that happened was I had a good voice and I played piano and I'd been singing in choirs. And as I mentioned, we had the jazz trio on Saturday and the folk singer on Friday, and one night I was sitting down with the folk singer and after customers had gone, we started singing together and he said, "You know, you've got a good voice." It was the worst thing he could have said. Because the next year I provided the music myself on the Friday and the Saturday, so I sacked the trio and sacked the bloke who complimented my voice. We had a piano in the restaurant, so I played piano and accompanied myself. And choosing the type of music was quite easy because I simply sang what I liked and found that our customers, who were all similar age, similar background, similar likes, they all liked what I sang too. So I had a bass voice, so I was able to do the sort of music that we all liked, which was Paul Robeson, Peter Dawson, John Charles Thomas, and Flanders and Swan. Anyone who was good, I sang, who fitted within that sort of range. And eventually, I found that managing quite a growing repertoire and looking after the piano and the voice was a bit much, so I advertised for an accompanist. And the lady turned up who turned out she was a nun in the presentation order, and she became my pianist. So then she played the piano while I sang. The problem with that was I couldn't really justify having the sheet music. I didn't want anyone to know that I hadn't really learnt the words properly. I always had to have them somewhere written out. So I figured that if I took up another instrument, I could then justify having the sheet music. So I bought a double bass, and I got a chap to give me a few clues on how to play the thing. So then that enabled me to have the double bass and a music stand which had not only the sheet music but also the words, which apply that way. We tried to make the restaurant as special as possible. I installed an aquatic tank out the back which enabled us to keep live trout, and I had a friend who was a marine biologist and he supplied us with live yabbies, so we kept them in the pond. And we had our children working in the restaurant. If you ask my daughter what these days she wouldn't like to work in, the first on the list obviously would be a restaurant. Eventually, I would have been quite happy, I think, to continue for maybe not forever, but quite a while. But my wife eventually drew the line, so we handed the restaurant over to some people who leased it, and they continued doing quite a good job. And I went back to the media, editing a local newspaper and doing their photography, and this is where it starts to get a bit murky. I went from there to the disability field and worked with an organisation called U3AW, which was in Victoria for people with physical disabilities. And eventually I ended up with an organisation called the Deaf Blind Care Association, the name speaks for itself, in Victoria, looking after people who were both deaf and blind. And while I was there, I was able to set up a national representative organisation to advocate for deaf blind people. Which previously, whenever they put in a submission to government and money became available, it ended up going either to the deaf community or to the blind community, because they were the ones with the loudest voices. So I set up an advocacy organisation that made sure that the deaf blind needs were properly looked after. Well, that gets me to there. What happened next?
Well, would you like to take a break for a few minutes? Would you?
Yeah, well, that might be good, might refresh my memory about what happened next.
I'll let you read my notes.
Can we go on from here? What happens when I leave here?
Can I ask
Yeah.
a question?
Please, Bob.
Are you going to tell us lots about your music career, or you will later, won't you? But
Watch
at
this
point,
space.
Yeah, at this point in time, did you miss your Friday and Saturday nights?
Well, that's right. When I left the restaurant, I started looking around. In fact, I spent quite some time performing in restaurants. There was a restaurant in U3AW that I performed in on Friday nights, another one in Dandenong, and another couple that I got myself an electronic keyboard and carted that around with me and speaker and whatnot and set up to entertain. Then I joined a quite a remarkable community choir called Canto Coro, which was set up. People commented sometimes on my politics, and they said, "You're left wing, aren't you?" And I don't actually aspire to any particular side of politics, but probably because of my associations, I can quite happily wear the title of being left wing, because that Canto Coro choir was actually part of the, I forget which union, it was a Melbourne.
A trade union?
Yes, it was a sort of trade union choir. It was sponsored by a particular trade union, and we were given money by the government and by the trade union movement to employ composers and musicians, and we commissioned folk operas, which we performed. And I was with them for about 4 or 5 years and sang some remarkable music. There was a predominance of Greek and South American members in the choir, and it was through them that I was exposed to the remarkable works of the Chilean poet Pablo Neruda, and some of his poetry was put to music by the Greek composer Theodorakis, and remarkable unions between those two musicians. And a few other operas we commissioned as well.
Your involvement in that choir led to a few adventures, overseas adventures, which we might pick up on after the break, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Yeah. Does anybody have any other questions that you'd like to put to Bob, just at the moment?
What was the name of your restaurant?
Muddy Creek Restaurant.
Ah.
Did it ever serve ice cream or cheesecake?
Yeah. Not while my mother-in-law was there, but I think my wife had the same traditions. Yeah.
Well, we got Bob to to the brink of his musical career, but it was the source of quite a few adventures for you too, wasn't it? With the choir you went travelling.
Yes, while I was with Coro, the group I mentioned, there was a chap there who also belonged to another choir called Gorney. And Gorney is a choir that was made up of only men, and they sing Bulgarian and Georgian songs. And we performed quite a bit around Australia at folk festivals, the Port Fairy and the National Festival a few times. But the most enjoyable part of the deal was that every 2 years, Gorney would tour Bulgaria and Georgia. They were tours arranged by the respective countries to generally to show musicians in their own countries the spread of their culture. Both Bulgaria and Georgia have a very rich musical and dance history, and they express their culture quite strongly through music and dance. And they would arrange a series of tours through the countryside of Australians singing Bulgarian and Georgian music, which the locals thought was quite fascinating when they went to look on the atlas and discovered how far Australia was away. They wondered why on earth we bothered to learn their music, but the music is fascinating, and it comes from a long history of beautiful, beautiful music. The reason it was every 2 years was that in Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia, there was a worldwide polyphonic music festival where choirs from around the world, all of whom sang Georgian music, would come and participate in a series of lectures and performances. The Georgians, more than any other country, express themselves through their music. I think they would rather sing than talk. I remember we went out into the vineyards once, and the grapes were being harvested, and as the individual bloke would fill up his bag, he wanted the chap in the tractor to bring the trailer over. In Australia, we'd say the chap who was picking the grapes would yell out to the tractor driver, "Hey George!" But in Georgia, he would launch into a very complicated song. It would go for about 3 or 4 verses to let the tractor driver know. But the interesting thing was that the traditions have gone on for so long that the words of these songs, nobody knows. Everyone's forgotten what the words mean, but the songs still have the same significance. When we were in Tbilisi, we were staying with a local family. One of the beauties about this travelling within the choir was that we always put up with local musicians and their families wherever we went. When we were in Tbilisi, we were with a lovely family with 2 teenage boys. When the Russians pulled out of Georgia, they left behind a very, very run-down infrastructure. One of the results of this was enormous potholes in the highways. The job of the 2 boys was to take us across the highway to the market on the other side. We weren't allowed to go on their own because the problem with these potholes was that cars would come whizzing down the road towards us, and ostensibly they'd miss us by a mile, but as they came to a pothole, they would have to swerve, and quite often they would then be swerving directly at you. So the job of the boys was, they were rather like the dogs that go out into the minefields. They'd steer us around the potholes so we got there safely. The other sign of the Russian occupation was that the electricity was still supplied by the Russians, but the Russians had a very ambivalent attitude towards the Georgians, as they do with any of the border states around Russia. They regard them with a great deal of suspicion. And to keep the Georgians in order, at 11 o'clock each night, the Russians would turn off the electricity, so that at 11:15 each night, our job was to go and fill the bathtub with water so we'd have enough water to flush the toilet during the night. That was sort of typical of the way the Russians reacted towards the Georgians in general. But they were a lovely, lovely people, the Georgians, and they treated us extremely well. Bulgaria, the situation was very similar, except of course there was no sign of Russian occupation, but they too were a lovely lot of people. And I'm still in touch with the receptionist at the Hotel Beseda in Sofia, where we stayed. She was a receptionist at the hotel, and I was saying to her one night, one of the problems about being a travelling musician was that you were treated to banquets each night, but unfortunately the banquets would always consist of roast chicken and salads. And I said I'd love to try some local cuisine. So she said, well, come out with me after I finish work and I'll take you to a local ethnic restaurant. We went. I was asked what I'd like for the first course. I looked down and there were tomatoes. And I thought, I haven't had tomatoes for ages. So I ordered the tomatoes. They were absolutely superb. I'm sure I'm speaking to a lot of you when I say they were tomatoes the way tomatoes used to be. They were so nice that when I was asked what I wanted for a main course, tomatoes again. I think poor old Advaita was a bit disappointed. She wanted me to sample something more exotic and Bulgarian based. But anyway, it's lovely. We're still in touch. I had a card for her just the other day. While I was over there, of course Australia is so far from anywhere. Once you get somewhere like that, you want to see whatever you can, but it's so far to get to otherwise. So the first year after I left Georgia, I went to Turkey. Spent a few weeks touring Turkey, and there again I found such lovely people, considerate people, and I fell in love with Kemal Atatürk, and I think how desperately disappointed he would be to see what's happening with the Muslims in government in Turkey these days. On the other occasion I went over there, I ended up going to England and Wales, and I took the opportunity to visit the town of Segrave, which is up in Leicestershire. And while I was there, I went to the local church and discovered in the Doomsday book, which was open in the church there, a reason for which some of you are possibly familiar with something called Dupuytren's contracture, which is where the tendons start to stiffen up down the hand, and it's known.
Here it is.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. And it's known as a Viking hand-down, whether because the Vikings were involved in so much rowing, I don't know. But from what I knew of my ancestry, I couldn't see where the Vikings came in, but there in the Doomsday book open, it showed how the Vikings had spread through this whole district and populated it, and so I had a sudden recognition of where I came from. And I told my wife when I discovered this, I'm off for a bit of raping and pillage. Just my blood speaking. She ignored it.
Treated it with the contempt it deserves.
Indeed, so she thinks, yeah. Yeah, so that was sort of the overseas stuff.
Can I put you on notice? We've had a request that you might sing for us a little
Oh,
bit.
yeah. One of the problems with that's one of the things I really missed was singing, and the problem with malt singing is that the muscles degenerate, and without the muscular support, the sound is rather unfortunate.
But we'll have to wait for your first album.
Indeed, yes, well worth waiting for.
Okay. Can I take you back a bit to your time working in disability industries? My own association with disabilities is at the same time it can be the most rewarding experience and the most frustrating.
The big frustration generally I found came from, this is why I worked so hard for advocacy for deaf-blind people. There was a terrible thought that used to float around the disability field. Wouldn't it be nice if more politicians had relatives with disability so that they could understand?
Well, they have.
There were some, Well, there were some outstanding ones who had children with disabilities, and their work in the disability field was excellent. But the majority, unfortunately, they just had no idea of what was involved. And there were the highs of actually achieving something, seeing results, but then there was the disappointment of preparing what you thought was a wonderful case and just seeing it shot down your plane through lack of understanding, lack of empathy, lack of rapport. But part of the job was, of course, to... I remember when I was young that people who were gay and people who came from other countries were regarded with a great deal of suspicion. I've tracked this down myself recently. I've discovered that there is a well of misogyny and racism within me, which, although I would have denied it, once you recognise it, you can then consciously work to overcome it. But this is often what mitigates against any success in those sorts of fields, because people are a lot better these days than when I was talking about in the days when I was young, when people who were gay didn't come out, and people with disabilities were kept in, as they could call them, asylums. So the general public were never in touch with them. And I think it's part of our evolution that part of our survival technique was to be wary of anything strange. Strangers, whether it's coloured skin or language or whatever. And unfortunately, like a lot of things in evolution, their use has disappeared, but they're still there, they take ages to go. I think.
I'd like us to return to some of those personal revelations in a little while. But you committed to a life on the road. You're in fact in the process at the moment of selling your campervan. But your campervan has been your liberation machine.
Well, it was an amazing life, really. It actually taught me so much that there's something in life that I've often felt how people in profession, you'll have to excuse me if I jump from one subject to another, but I sort of treat them as they arise.
It's the Bob Segrave show, Bob.
Thank you. No, when I did my national service, I felt it was great, not from the militaristic side, that was bad, but the fact that all kids, regardless of background, had to come together and learn how to live together. So you had wharfies and doctors' sons and whatnot, all having to learn how to get on with each other. And part of the problem generally, I think, we go through life, we live in a certain suburb, which means a certain socio-economic group, and then we go to school with those people, and often go to university or go into work with those people. We never know often anything about people from other groups. And one of the big things I discovered when I got on the road was how sheltered my life had actually been. I thought that, I had knocked around a fair bit, but I discovered that when I was out on the road and travelling and called into a camping spot, and I'd be sitting next to someone who voted completely differently from me or had a completely different slant on religion and whatnot, and it became a bit of a shock in many ways, but it was a marvellous levelling experience, I think, to learn, which I'd never had to. I'd had a very sheltered life, obviously, and I'd never actually learned. I had to learn how to get on with people who had these opposing points of view. So that was one of the first things I learned. The second thing I learned was that when I first bought the van and was leaving after my retirement presentation of the watch, I had a friend up in Darwin, and I said, well, we'll be up to see you, and he said, when? And I gave him the date. And when I retired and got into the van, I went straight up to Darwin, bypassed 10 Creek, well, it wasn't bypassing, I just went straight through and got to Darwin. And then I thought, how ridiculous. I'd passed through all these other places without actually stopping. So the next thing I learnt was that, and this is something that really has lasted me through life, or the remainder of my life, that the important thing is not the thing down there, it's what's here. And often the place that I was making plans to leave would be the great place to be, but I had my mind set on being somewhere else at a certain time, and that limited all my opportunities for lovely experiences along the way. So now I tend to not make up my mind about things in advance, which can be a bit of a problem for my friends if we want to go to something somewhere. I'll say, well, I'll let you know closest to the date.
We turned up today, Bob. You've done very good.
Full marks.
In your roaming, what sticks out? You said about meeting people at neighbouring campsites, but places, were there places in particular that carved a piece of your heart?
Well, after getting on the road first and travelling all over the place, Western Australia, Northern Territory, everywhere, I settled down into a schedule of coming down to Tasmania for the summer and heading north to a place called Kyogle for the winter. And Kyogle, to my mind, was an ideal community, similar in size to Wyndon, with similar good cafes and a nice library for internet connection and cheap accommodation at the showgrounds for self-contained vehicles. Beautiful scenery on the border of Queensland with the lovely border ranges and all that has to offer. And that met the conditions that I found most suitable for an equitable life. So I'd go up there every year and then come back to Tassie for the summer, which meant I had pretty well guaranteed myself my optimum temperature of 23 degrees throughout the year, which is why I have a bit of trouble in Tasmania now.
Are you going to tell us about the transition from a house and all the belongings and all the stuff that we've got and your
That was interesting.
campervan?
Yeah, I had. My big problem was an enormous CD collection, of course, and piano or keyboard, and a very big library of books. And
Has Robin benefited from that?
well, yeah, but what actually happened was that I transferred all my CDs to MP3s, so I got them on the computer, and gave away the books to the op shop, but I'm not too sure, 20 years ago, it might have been a bit early for a Kindle, but I started reading online, so I had my computer. The one thing I did discover was that when I went into the band and left all this, it was really as though a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I don't advise getting rid of stuff because there's any particular virtue in it. It was just that in my case, I found it quite a relief to be rid of a lot of stuff that I no longer had to care for. It took a bit of a weight off. And one of the advantages has been ever since, over the 20 years since I've been living in the van, that if I want to take on anything new, something's got to go out, sort of straight out. So I've got to make room for it. So I really have to justify taking anything new on board. And that can be quite a salutary experience too. Things that you think you desperately need on reflection, when you compare it with what you've got to check out, you realise they're not really that necessary after all. I think looking back, everything is a compromise, of course, and one thing I did miss was performing with other people. There's something, you only know it when you do it, but there's something special about singing with someone else. You get into a particular area of consciousness which is very satisfying, and when you become used to it and haven't got it, you miss it. And as a result, then your voice starts to deteriorate anyway. So,
When was the last time you sang?
I think it was probably at the Signet Folk Festival when Kearney came over to perform at the Folk Festival some 12 years ago, I think. That would have been it.
Well, vocal cords would be well and truly retired by now.
Indeed, yes.
Yeah.
Do you still give it a workout in the shower?
Oh, well, I do sort of tend to sing along with my myself, as long as I know there's no one within listening to it. Check everything carefully.
Bob, did you find that as you went from state to state that you could return library books as you went along?
Well, Tasmania has got the big advantage that you can pick up a book somewhere and
Yes.
drop it off anywhere.
Yes.
In other states, there are regional libraries, so you can, within the region, I think you can return them, but on a statewide basis, I don't think they have a similar system. But some places are very good. They give you, in fact, I'm still a temporary member of some libraries. If you're staying at a caravan park, they'll give you an interim membership which will enable you to take out, say, 3 instead of 10 books. And I've still got membership of it. And that is quite good because now I do most of my reading in the form of e-books. And those libraries are quite good because in the case of, say, the South Australian Library, I can still take out e-books from their collection. The Tasmanian collection is good, but the bigger states obviously have the bigger collections. And the other thing, I don't know how many of you know about, it's something called Freegle. If you're interested in music and you belong to the Tasmanian Library, there's a section where you can download 5 MP3s a week from quite a substantial collection. It's not housed within the university, it's an independent source of quite a large category of classical and modern music, and you can download it and keep it rather than having to return it.
Do you find that a bit sterile compared with being in a...
Sorry?
Yes, do you find that a bit sterile as opposed to being in a classical presentation, and even the Civic Centre in Burnie, the atmosphere?
I know which I prefer.
Yeah.
No, everything's a compromise. You do what you can. And, I mean, I go to whatever live performances are on. I've got booked up for the next series of performances. I've sent you
Yeah.
you got it.
We'll talk about it afterwards.
Yep. No, it's the same. I mean, in many ways, it's similar to travelling on your own. I mean, that's always a compromise. You can sort of choose to have someone else with you, or you can choose to go. I chose to go on my own. I love the feeling of, as I do now, I sort of get up in the morning and then decide what I'm going to do that day rather than try and decide in advance. But it's my decision. What I miss out on is, of course, being able to say, gee, look at that. It's a compromise, and you pick the best way you can.
As far as rubbing shoulders with people that might be considered to be despicable, to find out how they live life, what's your comment on that? I don't want to be too specific. Rubbing shoulders with criminals.
He doesn't want you to talk about me, you know.
Ladies of the night. I've discovered a lot from people that are considered to be not acceptable in some eyes with respect to...
I'm worried about the circles you're moving in.
I'm asking the question. I've done it deliberately to find out how people function.
Yeah, well, it's a personal thing. I think these days I'm far less inclined to find fault than when I was younger. I tend to accept people more for what they can offer rather than what I might think they might offer, because I've discovered that what I think is generally wrong. What I think is generally wrong. I'm relying less and less on my mind and discovering that personal experience is the way to go, rather than what you think about someone. And I know I can think of my mother as a prime example of where clothes, position in society, place you live, education background were all important. And that was what I was landed with early in the piece, and it lasted for quite a while.
Right.
So where are you now?
I'm right here. And when I say that, I mean there's something called reality, and we think we know what reality is, but in fact, thinking about reality is not reality.
Tease that out a bit.
It's when when I look here, I think, okay, this is probably getting a bit in advance of who I was actually at, but it came while on the road, sure. I realise that I'm not actually in touch with reality. My senses are in touch with reality, and I'm in touch with my senses. So there's always this sort of built-up. And it's only when I stop thinking, well, if I could, stop thinking or withdraw my attention to thinking, that I'm actually within reality. Because reality is reality without thought. Reality is just what is. As soon as thought comes in, that's not reality, that's thought. So when I say that I'm here, I like to think that I'm here, directly, personally.
Yes, where's possible if any haze when you need her. I'm quite sure you've intersected with a few Indian philosophies there.
There's one thing I forgot actually in all of this. About 7 years ago, when I would have been, 78, I thought, I've done a lot of yoga which I hadn't mentioned. I've been deeply involved with yoga over the years. And I think I discovered that yoga wasn't giving me everything I needed. I felt I needed a challenge at my age, so I enrolled as a volunteer at an establishment for people with disabilities, both intellectual and physical, in India. So I spent 6 months over in the foothills of the Himalayas working in an Indian charity, which I found was quite an experience, and it was that sort of challenge. As I said to people, I may be helping the people in India, but I'm doing far more for myself. If they benefit, that's fine. But really it was just the sort of travelling and managing my own affairs and whatnot all on my own in India that was the big challenge that I needed. So I think that possibly gave me a bit more confidence to get through the rest of my life. I think I was sort of crumbling at the edges a bit before I did that.
You appear to be a bit of a loner.
Sorry?
Is that, you appear to be a bit of a loner. Is that true or not true?
I'm quite happy with my own company.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I quite like people around too. I haven't got any particular preference, I think, either way. It's just I enjoy whichever way it crumbles, I think.
Yes, I think we all know there's a difference between being alone and being lonely, isn't
Yeah, sure. Well, I've got I think a lot of people can be scared by reflection. I quite embrace it, and I get a lot of pleasure out of time spent in what I call my laboratory up here, where I actually sort of work. And that can be quite solitary, but whatever you find out there, you have to test in the real world, so you need people anyway. You can't develop very much on your own without external references, I think.
Bob, do you mind if I raise the topic of your health?
Yeah, okay. I was diagnosed 12 years ago with prostate cancer, and they decided not to do anything about it at that stage. Just put me on a hormone implant regimen, which continued up until about a year ago. And then the cancer metastasised, so it got out into my bones and into my ribs. I'm currently got a cancer in the hip, which they irradiate it as much as they can. So just a matter of, I think, painkillers from here on. And obviously eventually it'll sort of spread, and I just keep going as long as the painkillers will enable me to keep going.
Yeah. So how do you process that in your laboratory?
Well, one thing I've learned, fortunately, is that you can't stop yourself thinking. The thoughts are always there, but what you can do is distance yourself from the thoughts, so that this is where it starts to get a bit sort of philosophical. It took me 2 or 3 years of intense study before I could really get across the subject because it's so counterintuitive. So you'll have to forgive me by
I think we're all strapped in for the esoteric, aren't we?
it's an ancient Indian philosophy going back some 4,000 years, but it also crops up in Buddhism, mystical Christianity, Sufism, just about every area of what's called spirituality that you can name. Spirituality I have trouble with because it still has overtones of religion. And this is not religion, this is not faith-based at all. It's a system of self-inquiry whereby you look inside yourself after you've conditioned your mind suitably, after that takes quite a lot of work over a period of time, so that you can actually recognise what's happening.
Bob, if it's not face-based, is it experiential for you?
It's experiential, yeah, that's all it is. You find out for yourself. Suck it and see it. So that you can't, nobody tells you, sort of what, there are pointers, but it's up to you to follow those pointers and see what you find. Nobody tells you what's there, you have to find out for yourself. And one of the early things I discovered was that it's the question of actually who am I? And up until that stage I had thought that I was my body, I was my mind. Whenever I said I or me, this is what I was referring to. But when I observed closely, I found that I can't be the body because I can observe the body. And I can't be my thought because I can observe my thoughts. And in the same way as a knife cannot cut itself, or your eyes can't see themselves unless in the mirror, you can't be what you can observe. And once through constant practice, well, eventually perhaps through constant practice, you can have a look at your thoughts and realise that you aren't them. So you can see the thoughts, but you're seeing it from something beyond thoughts, that which thoughts arise in. And that gave me a clue as to who I really was. Once that happens, to get back to your question, the problem of what happens in the future only becomes a problem if you think about it. If you don't think about something, as far as you're concerned, it's not there. It's only there when you actually start to think about it. And if you can learn to distance yourself from your thoughts, you have far less chance of being involved in the thoughts and being involved in negative thoughts, so that you can act purely and simply without the influence of all that conditioning of thoughts, I think.
What about the idea of distraction, to get away from those thoughts?
Distraction is what most of us pick, whether it's the fridge or games, but thinking itself is a distraction. It's a matter of looking at it and seeing it without trying to escape it, but to actually look at it and see it and recognise it. So it's there, but then you're here.
Is there any particular place that you most feel you are yourself?
Well, whenever I can distance myself from thinking, that's where I am. That's reality, really, and that's where we all are, but we just don't know it. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to say that. No, there are things we have to find out for ourselves, and it's not like sort of faith-based stuff where you try and pass that faith on. It's just a case of saying, well, this has been my experience.
Well, I don't wish to be awkward, but can I ask you, with the time that's left to you, are there things that you want to do?
Yeah, keep working on myself.
Right.
Yeah, that's the big driver, that's the big incentive. Because once you come to grips with this, I've always thought in science that scientists pursue what they do because they're accumulating knowledge. But from my experience, I would assume that a lot of it is because of understanding. That the benefits you get from understanding far outweigh the benefits you get from an accumulation of knowledge. And I find that as my understanding increases, so the number of what I call aha moments increase, And with each aha moment, there's a very pleasant buzz in the brain, which is a sort of feedback of saying, hello, we're onto something here.
Can you give us an example of something like that, Bob? The sorts of...
The very first sign I had of this, I mean, I had been studying things like yoga and Buddhism and whatnot for years and years and years, but I had been studying them, which means I was getting sort of knowledge, but that knowledge isn't a vital thing. It doesn't work. It doesn't actually do anything. It doesn't change the system. So what I had to do was...
The theory of it, you mean? So basically it was the theory of it rather than the practice of it.
That's right. Yeah. So somehow I got onto this topic of Advaita Vedanta, which is the old Indian philosophy. And I read that you must put things into practice. You don't just read them, you actually do them. And one of the things was to investigate whether the pleasure is in the object or whether the pleasure is simply there all the time. And at the time I had an object coming through the mail that I was quite looking forward to. And that was building up a bit of pressure. I was anxious for it. There was desire. The old Buddhist thing about desire being a bad thing. It's a bad thing because it covers up the happiness. This thing eventually arrived, and fortunately I was observing what was happening. I had the object, but the object itself was still in the package. But pleasure had arisen just through the knowledge that this had actually arrived. So I realised what had happened was that that particular desire had been removed once I knew the object was here. And once that desire had been removed, happiness came up. So it started to make me think that happiness is our natural state. The only thing that stops it is unhappiness. Various things laid over this sort of happiness. That made me realise that there were a lot of things I didn't know about myself and sort of started me off. But the first real thing that intrigued me was that I'd always thought I was in control of what I was doing, that I would sit and I would decide to do this and I would do it. But then I discovered to my amazement that my decisions were made at a completely subconscious level, and when asked to explain it, my mind would come up with the most egotistical thing it can, like I did it because I'm such a good person, or because I want to do this or want to do that. Whereas actually I had no clue whatsoever about how that decision was arrived at, but it was arrived at. And I thought, well, this is very strange. How can decisions be made on their own? And then I realised that my blood courses through my body quite happily. My heart keeps beating quite happily. So everything will work if we only learn to leave it alone. It took away, if I started to analyse it, it's as though, and neuroscience has actually proved this, that they cannot find any sign whatsoever of anything operating the machinery. The machinery just operates itself. There are then thoughts which crop up, and we adopt the thoughts, and the thoughts take us over. But there is no actual motivating thing there apart from these thoughts. Now, this starts to get very, very complicated and, as I say, counterintuitive, but those are a couple of things that sort of helped me decide that I was on the right track.
Well, I'd like to give people a chance to chisel away at your granite there with a few questions in a moment, but I'm going to exercise my prerogative to ask the first one, and I should have asked it when we were talking about you being on the road. How did you find, after losing 2 children in road accidents, weren't they?
One was abseiling,
Right.
one was...
So did that give you a heightened sense of peril while you were travelling around in your campervan?
It could have subconsciously. It might have affected my driving, perhaps, but I wasn't conscious of it. I wasn't aware of it.
Right.
So much of what happened, well, I've learned that so much of what happens, as far as I'm concerned, is operating at a subconscious level that I'm really only in touch with the tip of the iceberg.
Yes, I'm struck by what you said though at the time, that, you know, with the loss of your children, you were thinking about it from your point of view. It was an ego-centered thing. I would have thought that somehow that might have factored into your, I don't know, to your peripatetic lifestyle.
It may well have, yeah. I mean, my reflections on why certain things that have influenced me are only because I can sort of recognise them. There are a lot of other things that I can't recognise, and I just don't know why, but they're there.
Do you mind if we take questions now? Merritt, did you?
How far does, your problem with prostate cancer, how far do you think that nature should take control, in the sense that if there's something wrong, that you don't necessarily have to abide by the medical advice and so on, that nature is in fact controlling your life from birth to death, and therefore you let nature control your life, in a sense?
Yeah, well, I think on a broad spectrum, the things that I observe and know about medical science is part of that whole, is part of nature as far as I'm concerned. It's part of the, I mean, I know where you're coming from, sure, but I've got no personal. When it was first diagnosed, I sort of let myself over to the medicos. I thought, well, they're the people that have had all the training. And ever since I've been happy just to leave it to them. That's just a personal choice. I have friends who spend a lot of their time online looking into cures, and you were talking about sort of natural remedies.
No, I'm just saying, just let things be.
Oh, let things be. Right.
Serendipity, if you like.
Yeah. Yes, I didn't really consider that as an alternative. I thought, and I don't these days either. I think, I mean, I've had 12 years of quite good living.
Right.
Had I just not done anything, I'm sure I would have left quite a while ago.
Yep.
That doesn't explain why I decided that. I didn't really decide. It was just, you got cancer, you get it treated. I'd never considered not getting it treated.
Right.
Please.
I was interested, Bob, that when Mal asked you what are you going to do with the rest of your life, and you were jumped at the fact that you're going to learn more about you. My question is why? Why is that the important thing left to you now?
Now, my mind will come up with all sorts of reasons, like ultimately I'd like to benefit mankind more than I'm benefiting mankind, and to be more good to people around about, or get more enjoyment out of life. But I'm sure the real reason is that it gives me so much pleasure. The more I learn about myself, the more pleased I become.
Yeah, cool.
And the closer I get to happiness, because it's almost as though I'm removing layers. Happiness is here, basically, within everyone. We've all got various layers on top. And gradually, with understanding, because most of these layers are completely due to misunderstanding, not knowing who we are, as I remove those layers, so happiness gets closer and closer to the surface.
So basically enlightenment, you know, if you want to put it in those terms.
Sorry?
Basically enlightenment is what you...
Well, that's a word that some people use.
But it's the same concept.
It's really getting in touch with reality is the way I like to think of it. The closer I get to reality, because what stands between my consciousness and reality are all these sort of illusions and whatnot that I've built up over the years, and as I sweep those aside, my consciousness becomes closer and closer to reality, so that you can be one with reality, or you can be shielded from reality by all these misconceptions.
I might be misunderstanding you, but what amazes me and awes me is that what it seems to me that you're saying is that you have got to know who you are by not thinking about and not being introspective. Is that?
No,
Do I
no,
understand?
sorry. No, the not thinking is, I don't think you can stop thinking, but most of it, for most of my life, I identified completely with thinking. That was all there was. As I've removed myself slightly from thinking, so my life has become so much easier. And I think in my daily life, I'm acting more naturally than I had previously. It's as though all those years of conditioning of my mind were getting between my consciousness and reality by almost building a wall. There are areas of consciousness that can actually work and do things and improve the system, and there are areas of consciousness that...
So would you describe it as like a force field that was there before?
Sorry?
Would you describe it like a force field, like, I don't know how, like a shield? I've heard a description where people say it's like an atmospheric force. It's so strong, stopping you getting drawing.
Well, you could describe all... I mean, the thoughts are the mind. Mind comes into existence when thoughts arise, and what those thoughts then do is interact between my awareness, my consciousness, and what is out here as reality. Now, it could be described as a force. To my mind, it's almost like a blockage. It's something which intercedes between myself and reality, and that's the ego, which is a result of thought, which is part of the mind.
Are you able to manage that? Can you manage that yourself, or is this something that's beyond your control?
It becomes... when I first started study, I found a lot of things were completely beyond my comprehension. When I started to think about something, my mind would head off into what I'm going to have for dinner and what's on the laundry list and how the bank account's going, and I had no control over that. Through meditation and through the proper use of yoga, not just the physical side that's so popular in the West, but the full panoply of yogic practices, I learnt to have more control over the mind, as a result of which I was able to apply myself more to study than I had previously. And through that extra control that I learned, I was able to control my involvement with my thoughts. So the thoughts were still there, and I could sort of almost glance at them, but it was as if from a distance, whereas previously the thoughts would be taken on board and they would be me and I would speak as my thoughts were. Now I've got more and more of an ability to stand aside from them and to observe them and to act from somewhere else, not from the thoughts but from somewhere deeper, from that within which thoughts arise.
How would you define happiness? How would you define happiness?
Happiness is the absence of unhappiness, which sounds a truism, but really that's what I find is that happiness is my basic position. The unhappiness arises from what's piled on top of the happiness, so that I can't experience the happiness if I've got all this crap on top.
So in today's world of money, possessions, of individualism, etc., 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 in today's world, how do people cope with this state of mind? How do they, if it's possible for people to adapt to this state of mind, how can society sort of embrace this idea of yours, do you think?
Oh, quite happy, some people with money who were quite unhappy. I'm not advocating anything, I'm not saying you should
No,
do
that's
this.
your personal point of view, yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Anyone else? Grilling while we've got him.
I found it wrong. If I can just say so, this man here, I'm pointing at you, I shouldn't do things like that, but I've had small chats with you in the library and out in the you've been a great help in
Good.
terms of trying, I mean, I'll go off on another tangent and start on a tirade of some sort, political or otherwise, but then some of the ideas that you've been talking about this afternoon and in the library and so on, it brings me back a bit. Tells me to sort of just calm down and, become at times possibly self-centered.
Roger on a political tirade. Who can imagine that?
Well, there you go. I mean, it doesn't work all the time. Only 10% of the time.
Okay, I want to conclude by first of all saying to Bob, thank you so much for agreeing to do this, and I realise that it is a bit of a physical strain for you, and it's certainly a bit of an emotional strain for you too, I think. But I, for one, am deeply grateful that you found that you could do it. So thank you. And if you would like,
And in terms of U3A, I think we're honoured to actually have so many interesting people, and that we've got the time to listen to somebody who is so interesting. That makes all of us much more interesting as the result of having been here for 2 hours, Promise.
I didn't want to be too solicitous, but I did think that part of what Bob was saying about the campsite where you meet all kinds of people, U3A is a bit of a campsite. And the thing that I think motivates most of us to come to this particular campsite is we go away just a little bit richer for the occasion.
Very much so.
Yeah.
And this was inspirational, I thought.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
That's how I find it.
Yeah.
Yeah.